Welcome to City Forum. My name is Min Zhang. I'm a faculty member in the CRP program, Community and Regional Planning, the School of Architecture. I'm the faculty City Forum coordinator. Here we have Aisha, Lauren Menat, the City Forum student coordinator. We are the City Forum team for this coming year. And for this year, we tried a couple of things new. One, we are very much kind of a student interest focused. Over the summer, Aisha did a quick survey, asking for the names, topics that you are mostly interested in. Second, we try to line up the talks, the foreign speaker series for the entire semester, rather than just kind of like a ad hoc or every time, for the purpose of informing the people, you or other people, so that they can schedule their times wisely, coming over here for the talk. So we tried it, and so far kind of successful, thanks to Aisha's hard work. And here, this is the 7 speakers already identified, well, to a great extent confirmed. The last one, there might be some kind of changes depending on our budget. We're figuring out a budget because the person is traveling from out of town. Okay, so that's pretty much the plan for this semester. And Aisha is also working on the speaker series for the spring. So stay tuned. Well, one tradition we keep is that we always have our own faculty member to kick off our City Forum for the new semester. So this semester, we have Dr. Gian-Claudia Sciara. So welcome, Dr. Sciara.
Thank you. Just checking that it works. Previous. Okay, it works. Well, I'm really delighted to be here. Thank you all for showing up in such great numbers. And I will be speaking with you today about a project that has been long in the making and has been completed over this summer. The title of my talk is When Do Local Governments Regulate Land Use to Serve Regional Goals? And this study is a study that represents the culmination or bringing together of a couple of my different interests. I'm interested in both transportation planning at the regional scale and also connections between transportation and land use or physical development patterns, and what that means for sustainable outcomes at the city and regional level. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, great. So by way of a roadmap, I chose for this talk to zoom out a little bit rather than leap right into the study and the purpose. I wanted to give you some context about where this particular study fits in the literature, why it's important for planning. So I'll be talking some about land use or our efforts to steer physical development in ways that can reduce vehicle travel and hence reduce greenhouse gas emissions from vehicle travel. So I'll spend a little bit of time about what we know in general, give you kind of a bigger picture, and then I'll talk about California's approach to the use of land use as a greenhouse gas and VMT reduction tool. And California is the central focus of the study I'll report to you about today. I'll shift to California and describe why the California case, in particular, a relatively recent state policy, is really interesting for thinking about connections between transportation and land use, and the government entities that are responsible for these domains, and how this new policy in California creates what you might identify as pretty much a classic institutional collective action problem. In other words, it asks local governments to collaborate and cooperate in ways that might not necessarily be in their first interest, or might ask them to do things that might not be their first choice. And then we'll cut to the research questions, understanding what California local governments are doing with regard to this new policy, and trying to understand what makes them do it. And we'll go through how I approached my research questions and methods, and we'll talk about the results and the implications for planners. So just to shoot ahead, I find it's often helpful to begin with the end in mind. And so I'll say that what I hope you'll come away with from this talk is an appreciation that using land use policy to affect the extent to which people drive is tough. It's really tough. So, does that mean we should all just pack it in and go home? Climate change is inevitable. So many studies saying that we need to reduce the extent to which we drive, and maybe we should just forget that project. Local governments have a key role in this because they make choices about the land use and development patterns that influence whether or not we drive, how much we drive, how many trips we make, how far we drive. And so we could just say, well, we'll leave them to their own devices. I hope that what you'll find is that the answer should be no, that there is good reason to think that local governments will do the right thing when we can see that it's in their interest. They will also respond to inclusive planning efforts to get them to make development and land use choices that could help to reduce VMT. And many will respond to incentives to get them to develop in ways that are more compact and could help to reduce vehicle miles of travel. And as planners and policymakers, we can capitalize on that. So this stream of research that I've been working on, this is kind of the bigger picture. The connection between transportation and land use is very well studied in the transportation and urban planning literature. Mostly, the studies lie here. So a lot of work has explored what can we do to influence the amount of driving people do, what are the development and spatial patterns, the physical attributes, the built environment patterns that would influence whether or not someone walks or drives or takes transit, or how far they have to walk, or how often they might make trips. So let's look a little bit at this work. The connection between land use, or the built environment, and driving, or vehicle miles of travel, is again probably one of the most well-studied areas in transportation. Lots of studies to the point where now the sort of cutting-edge literature is producing meta-analyses, so analyses of all the studies, really trying to synthesize the research and test which connections are strongest given the available studies. There's a lot of complexity in this literature. When we look at studies that try to link attributes of the built environment to people's travel behavior. All kinds of things come up. Self-selection questions are, do people locate in places where they can bike and walk? And maybe it's their preference for doing that makes them drive less because they chose that environment, or is it the environment itself that's leading them to make those choices? A lot of the studies in this literature have problems with small sample sizes. Also, the effect sizes or the elasticities that have been shown are generally on the small side, so the effects are modest. There's also some evidence that there is selective reporting bias. And by that I mean that in the planning field we tend to think compact development is a good thing. Planning journals, as has been shown in other fields where there's kind of an accepted knowledge or accepted conclusions, accepted relationships, planning journals may be more likely to publish results that confirm this relationship between compact development and travel behavior. And certainly researchers have an incentive to work harder when they develop models to find the model that confirms this. So there may be some of that in this literature as well. But we do, I think, have a relatively good sense of how land use and travel behavior, or land use and VMT, are related. And a lot of this work has focused on what are called the D variables. These are ways that we describe the built environment of a city or a metropolitan region, how accessible are destinations in that region, how dense is the region, what is its design in terms of the physical fabric, particularly the street network. Is it a lot of 1950s post-war loops and lollipops, or is it a very connected grid where there's high accessibility from origins and destinations? Is there a diversity of land uses? Or do we concentrate uses in special districts so that we wind up separating places where people reside from places where people might work, from places where people might shop? And what are distances, average distances to transit? So these have been, all of the studies I've said in this domain, they've all centered around these variables. And we do have, I think, some general consensus in the field that yes, these variables matter, but they don't matter quite as much as we might hope they do. And so they have a more modest impact on people's travel choices and ultimately their VMT. So you can see here that the effect size on the right, or the elasticities, are mostly negative, except in the case of land use. I won't go into the detail as to why there are two sets of elasticities reported from this. This is one of really the most recent and probably most advanced meta-analysis of this literature. So there is some consensus that, yeah, this is a good thing to do. So that's, the relationship over here between spatial development patterns and VMT. There's also some literature looking further upstream. So, okay, well, we know if we want a built environment that looks like this, what do we do to get there? And so there's been some work that looks at state level policy and how and whether or not it has an impact on local level land use planning and development patterns. Because there have been some pretty significant statewide efforts at growth management, particularly if you think of Maryland or New Jersey, particular cases, there have been a fair number of studies here, but I'd say on the whole, the evidence is mixed with respect to state level policy to try to reduce sprawl, rein development in such a way that it's more compact, located in existing urbanized areas. And it's also unclear which policy mechanisms are most effective. So there are ways that states can incentivize quote unquote smart growth. There are also general state mandates for local planning. That's been shown to have an effect, that merely by the act of saying, local governments, you must produce a general plan and think about how you'll grow for the next 20 years, that can have a salutary effect on local growth planning. Also, some states might enact consistency requirements, having kind of a larger statewide policy about growth, and then requiring local governments to mimic that policy or align with it or reflect that policy in their local general plans and policies. This is an area where we know less. So what might happen at the regional level to influence local planning and development decisions? The adoption of general plans that might set a local government, a city or a county up for more compact development, or the adoption of a zoning ordinance that helps to increase density. We don't really know so much about interactions between local governments making these choices and regional level efforts, either by councils of government or metropolitan planning organizations or other region-wide efforts to shape those policies. We do know that to the extent they've been studied, they're often tied to funding incentives. And what evidence there is that they are having some effect on local government choices, it suggests these incentive strategies are, fairly modest, having a modest impact. So this is where the study I'll talk to you about today is kind of fits in this grander scheme of the literature. And this is what's going to bring me to California. In the grander scheme of things, California is, as we know, a leader, has been for many decades on the environment and more recently on the climate front. And the state has made a lot of state-level policy commitments to reducing greenhouse gases across all sectors of its economy. It has a particular interest in reducing greenhouse gases from transportation because in California, transportation is responsible for an oversized share of the state's greenhouse gas emissions. So if you look at this pie chart for any state or the national average, the transportation sector is generally responsible for a little bit less than 30%, maybe 27, 28% of greenhouse gas emissions. But in California, it's much higher. So among its policy commitments to reducing greenhouse gases, the state has really focused in on transportation. And that's what brings us to this policy. That's the subject of my study. It is called the Sustainable Communities and Climate Protection Act. It was passed in 2008. And it is really a policy that tries to achieve greenhouse gas reductions in transportation in a less direct way than other transportation climate policies in California. And it's going after these greenhouse gas reductions somewhat indirectly through land use planning. In a nutshell, the law and the policy is premised on the knowledge that we have that when we build communities that are isolated, either through the design of their street network or their physical development, or are more isolated in the way that we've chosen to combine uses and allow different functions of a city to locate, that leads to more dispersion of origins and destinations. And that dispersion of origins and destinations encourages greater reliance on automobiles to get places and take care of our daily needs, and that has climate impacts. On the flip side, when we build communities that are more accessible, that are more dense, where we can bring origins and destinations closer together, we are more likely to see people driving less, first and foremost, and also greater likelihood for people to be using alternatives with some benefits, and not only sustainability and environmental benefits, also public health benefits, economic benefits. So this policy is really part of a larger three-pronged approach to transportation greenhouse gases in California. These other prongs are really more prominent in the state policy portfolio, and they certainly will have greater impact over the long term. But SB 375 is really interesting for its very long-term thinking. So these other approaches to transportation, vehicles. So California has a lot of laws and policies on the books that encourage the production and consumption of more fuel-efficient vehicles. So, sort of prompting new technologies and the uptake of electric vehicles, zero-emission vehicles. It's been a leader on that front for quite some time. Fuels. The state has also done a lot through state-level policy to have fuel producers reduce over time the carbon content of fuels and to experiment with newer, more innovative fuels for motor vehicles. And the third leg is really efforts by the state to reduce transportation GHGs through shifting mobility patterns. So changing the way people travel, how we get around. And that's where SB 375 fits in. So I'm going to skip ahead 2 slides to say here. So the innovation of 375 is that it overlays on the existing metropolitan transportation planning process a new requirement. So this metropolitan transportation planning process in the hands of regional metropolitan planning organizations, or MPOs, like Campo in Austin. This is a process that's federally required. It's been in existence since the 1970s, and it's conducted with a fair amount of uniformity throughout the United States in any urbanized region above 50,000 in population. And so California has added a new requirement to this federal planning process, and that is the development of a sustainable communities strategy, or what's called a sustainable communities strategy. And in essence, what the sustainable community strategy is a regionally articulated vision of future development that matches the horizon year of the plan, usually 20 years out. A regional forecasted vision for development that, when you match it up with the transportation investments that are planned over that period, that same period, will lead to reduced greenhouse gas emissions in that particular region. So it is region specific, and it is also bounded by a region specific greenhouse gas reduction target. So these are that framework, I could tell you more about that maybe in the Q&A if you're interested, but kind of the key thing to know is that there's this new regional land use vision that's required in the regional transportation plan. Oh, and by the way, it's non-binding. Oops. So it really, because this regional land use vision is connected to a greenhouse gas emissions budget for the region, it really does compel a new approach to regional growth. And this is visible in the San Diego case. You can see on the left how the region was planning for its 2020 vision prior to SB 375's passage. And so that also was a forecasted pattern of regional development, but the forecast looked a lot more dispersed than what you see on the right, which is the more recently adopted vision taking SB 375 into account. So what you see is that they've really changed their expectations about the spread of residential development, the blue dots, the expansion into the interior of commercial development, the purple dots, and also expectations about the preservation of undeveloped or open space. So you can see there's a lot more green on that right-hand side vision that's being preserved. So this is really no small task. And it presents a particularly interesting institutional collective action problem, precisely because this regional vision is articulated at the metropolitan scale, and it's also non-binding. But for its implementation, it's really entirely dependent upon the decisions of local governments. So how counties and cities in California choose to develop, what kinds of general plans they adopt, what kinds of zoning ordinances they pass, what kinds of developments they approve, what kinds of impact fees they might adopt, what kinds of exceptions to their plans and zoning ordinances they might allow, all will impact whether or not this is somewhat feasible on the regional scale. So this leads me to my research questions, which in essence are local governments collaborating? Are they playing along? Are they adopting zoning strategies that would increase compact development? And if so, what's driving them to do so? And this set of questions is interesting both from a practical standpoint, because we are very interested in whether or not this policy is going to have an impact or is having an impact. But it's also really interesting theoretically and conceptually when we think about how local governments relate to, interact, and work with one another to achieve benefits on a larger scale than a single individual jurisdiction. And there's some theory that I draw upon in this work that describes why we might expect local governments to collaborate with one another, under what conditions that collaboration might occur. So certainly the anticipation of specific costs and benefits of implementing this law would be important. There has been a lot written about the fiscalization of land use, that local governments increasingly make land use and development decisions based on their capacity to bring in revenue, that's their first priority. And to the extent that local governments would have to decline development or discourage certain types of development that might bring in a lot of revenue, they might not want to do that. That might be seen as a cost. They might also see some risks if they turn down or discourage developers from coming to their community. What's to stop that same developer from knocking on the neighbor's door and the neighbor will just say yes. And so they get the tax revenue. There could also be some benefits. Their local residents might like the idea of developing in ways that would reduce vehicle reliance, less traffic potentially, better public health, more access to walking and biking. There's also some literature suggesting that organizational capacity is important for local governments to work together. And particularly, this makes sense. It also adds to everyone's employment prospects at the end of the program. But really, the more well-staffed a local government is, the more it can do. You know, I mean, it takes time to talk to your neighbors and to understand what they're doing. It takes time to understand what that regional forecasted land use vision is and how your particular general plan or zoning ordinance can support it. These things take time, and they take committed, knowledgeable, technically savvy staff. There's literature that suggests that previous efforts, regional efforts matter. That cities that have worked together before are likely to do so in the future if they have a history there. And also from the policy implementation literature, to the extent that a local actor really understands what's being asked of them, to the extent they've bought into or participated in the development of a larger vision, they are more likely to do things to support it. And so that all makes sense. So, to answer my research questions, I developed and implemented a survey of local governments in California, both cities and counties. Now, California has more cities. I think the total number of cities in California is 470 something, and counties has 58 counties. But I targeted only those 435 cities and only those 39 counties that fall within the boundaries of a metropolitan planning organization and hence are affected by one of these sustainable community strategies. So there are lots of other more rural cities and a few counties as well that are not affected by SB 375, and they're not as of great interest for this particular question. The respondents I targeted were the planning directors or the community development directors, so we went kind of to their management level people, and we wanted to know about how that local government was responding to this new state policy, whether or not it was adopting strategies that would be supportive of this policy. And these are the people who are best positioned to know. So after reaching out to those cities and counties, we had an overall response of 180 local governments, 158 cities, and 22 counties. Here I will have to do a special shout out to those of you who know Farsad. The reason we have a academically respectable response rate is Farsad, who called up a lot of those people and said, hey, take our survey. So thank you, Farsad. Yeah. So what did we ask people? What did we want to know from cities and counties? First and foremost, we wanted to know about their land use strategies. So we asked them about a set of strategies and whether or not these strategies were represented in their zoning code or zoning ordinance. We were also interested in their pursuit of incentive grants to implement SB 375. So in California, there are a number of state funding pots that local governments can apply for specifically to assist them with the implementation of capital projects or even underlying planning to implement SB 375's objectives. We also asked them about their history of collaboration in the region, the extent to which they were aware of the regional transportation planning process, were they engaged in it, what did they think about it, and then we asked them explicitly about the costs and benefits that they might anticipate would accrue to them from the implementation of the sustainable community strategy in their region. In other words, if San Diego went from that image on the left to the image on the right, what would that mean for the local government? What would be on the plus side and what would be on the minus side? And then we asked them also about the extent to which local stakeholders in their city had consistent views on growth and development. And here another shout out to Sarah Strand, a graduate student at UC Davis who was instrumental in developing our survey instrument. She had a lot of experience working at this regional local interface and brought a lot of that knowledge to the project. So again, these were our question batteries that we had really intended on using the measures of land use strategies and the pursuit of incentive grants as the dependent variables in the study. For various reasons, I wound up just focusing on the land use strategies. I'll go into why the incentive grants didn't really look like they would be that productive for trying to model some of the outcomes. And model estimation. So what did we do with this data? We would have done nothing with it were it not for Andrew. I hope he's in there. There he is. Okay. Shout out to another student, Andrew Hill, who worked hard on processing this data over the summer. And what we developed was a model of what could predict the number of SB 375 or compact development favorable land use strategies that a local government had adopted. So our dependent variable was this count of land use strategies. In our survey, we asked local governments to tick off whichever of 8 key strategies a city could pursue in its zoning code to promote compact development or smart growth. And then we used the independent variables drawn from our survey questions, some measures of regional planning awareness, engagement, and satisfaction. We experimented with a couple different ways of doing that, through a single composite measure, through different factor analysis-based measures. We developed measures from our survey data on the extent of prior regional collaboration, anticipated benefits of implementation of this sustainable communities strategy, and some measures of sustainable growth consensus in that particular local government. And we included in our study a number of control variables, things maybe outside of the framework of our survey that we anticipated might have an impact on local government's behavior. So certainly population size, how quickly the local government was growing, median household income, some data on political preferences, whether or not the city was a charter city. California is a state that allows local governments to adopt charters. We thought cities that were independently minded enough to adopt their own charter might not sign on to this regional vision. They might just want to do their own thing. Planning staff capacity. In some later modeling efforts, we developed measures of fiscal capacity and also some indicators as to how aggressively that local government had pursued state funding for implementation. Those are kind of side notes. They didn't figure into the main model. So our sample cities, I won't dwell here, but this comparison of the cities in our sample to cities on average in California shows that really we do have a pretty representative sample by lots of measures. And for that, I will again say that when we got to that telephone recruitment stage, we kind of looked at who had responded to our survey to date. And when we said, well, we want to be up in the high 30s for our response rate, we were pretty deliberate about who we went after to make our sample more representative. So some survey results. What we found is that there were some pretty diverse patterns in the adoption of these zoning strategies that we asked local governments about. Most common, local governments were more likely to say they were doing things to promote mixed use or infill. Least commonly, local governments said they had some kind of urban growth boundary in place, or they had some provisions to increase building heights. And also we learned that use of the state available implementation grants appeared lower than we anticipated. So there may be some underutilization of these state grants to help local governments. On the left, you see these are the strategies that we asked the local governments about. Does your zoning code provide, or your zoning ordinance provide for any of these strategies? And a lot of local governments said yes. Again, kind of the biggies are infill and mixed use. Less common are the urban growth boundary. We also compared the responses between cities and counties to see if counties were adopting different strategies from cities. That was only true in the red, the numbers that are highlighted in red. So urban growth boundaries, counties were more likely to be utilizing some type of urban growth boundary, and also they were more likely to be engaged in open space preservation. And here, if we just show kind of total strategies employed by local governments overall, again, not too shabby. Not too many are doing all 7, but a fair number are doing some. If we look at, again here, which of the strategies are sort of more commonly adopted, again, you see mixed use and infill, and the urban growth boundary and building heights being less popular. So, city scores for pursuing plan implementing grants. So based on the survey questions that we asked, if cities were going after these different grants, we developed a score that reflects how well they were aware of the various grant possibilities, if they had applied for them, if they'd gotten them. A large number over here were not aware at all, and this is a little concerning. And certainly, that's kind of mediocre performance if you think that the state is making funds available. We asked them about 8 different types of opportunities, and really, from a planning perspective, would like to see higher performance up here. Okay, model results. So as often happens with this kind of research, you have all these great expectations and then none of them work out. So that's what it is. But there are some interesting things to report from our survey. I think the takeaways, one of the more interesting things is that consistently population showed up as significant, always significantly positive. So really the larger a city, the more likely it was to be adopting these strategies, or the more strategies it would be adopting. So population size really did matter. Planning staff capacity mattered. In fact, it really mattered more than regional collaboration. We had some earlier models where regional collaboration was showing up, and we thought, great, that's consistent with the literature. But as soon as we factored in planning staff capacity, that won the day. Overall planning engagement and satisfaction, also important. And I think that's really interesting in the SB 375 case, because this particular law in the provisions that require the sustainable community strategy, there's also a lot of provisions that outline new public participation and new process requirements to make sure that the region is working with the local governments, bringing the local governments along in the development of this strategy. It's good to see that show up. In really any city, the percentage of Green Party voters was pretty small, but it tended to have an impact consistently. Charter city really, didn't matter. We thought those independently minded cities, it didn't really matter one way or the other. Nor did the general consensus about sustainable growth. We also experimented with looking at what would predict the adoption of individual strategies. So the total column in blue, that's the model results that I just showed you with the things showing up that we just talked about. Planning capacity, planning engagement. For the total number of strategies that a city adopts, those things matter. But we tried, maybe we thought there'd be some variation by adoption of particular strategy. There, results were not terribly interesting. There wasn't really any, overall patterns that showed up, except for population. So, where does this leave us? I think what we learned from our survey and trying to understand whether or not local governments are doing things to implement this regional policy is that city size does seem to confer a consistent advantage. Larger cities are likely to do more. Certainly having some positive awareness of the regional planning process, engagement in it, and positive perceptions about it are more likely to lead to adoption of supportive strategies for implementing that regional land use vision. Again, prior collaboration seems to matter, but not really once you account for both planning engagement and also staff capacity. And it's kind of difficult to say much about what drives adoption of individual strategies. So we said, we know that using land use as a tool to reduce vehicle miles of travel and driving and hence greenhouse gas emissions is tough. It's tough because of kind of the modest impact that these strategies tend to have. It's also tough because it's hard to get local governments to do things that they don't want to do. And land use is fundamentally the responsibility of local cities and counties. So I asked, should we just pack it in or we just forget about it? So I think that the answer is no, I think this work shows that there's evidence that a rigorous planning process and rigorous engagement by local governments in a regional land use vision can matter to implementation. I think we see some evidence that most local governments are doing something. Again, bigger things are mixed use, infill, density, open space preservation. Interestingly, state grant support is important, but it's not really fully utilized. So I think there is maybe a practical message there for the state to do more to promote the availability of these implementation grants that can help local governments to better align their planning with this more sustainable regional land use vision. And also local governments tended to see potential benefits more impactful than costs. So when we asked them about the pluses and minuses of potential implementation of the regional plan, the responses tended to weigh more heavily on the plus side, which is a favorable thing. Local governments thought they'd stand to see better air quality, better public health, more housing options than some of the downsides. So coming back to where we started, I hope that while we don't know a whole lot about this regional local interaction, now we know a little bit more. And with that, I would like to say a very large thank you to the University of Texas School of Architecture and the Graduate School for some of the research support for this completing this project, as well as Caltrans and UC Davis's Sustainable Transportation Center, and invaluable research assistance from Andrew Hill, who is able to be with us, Farsad Mashoud, and Sarah Strand. So, thank you.
We start a little bit late, so we can stretch a little bit beyond 1 o'clock. Next time, we'll be sure that we'll start lunch earlier. Then we'll have an on-time presentation. So, floor is open. Questions? Yes.
You talked about the three-pronged approach to reducing greenhouse gases, and that the land use transportation portion is really a long-term strategy. In like the next 50 years, do you know like what portion of GHG reduction they expect to come from the land use transportation versus the vehicle and the fuel portion?
I couldn't tell you precise. I mean, it's small. It's single digits. You know, less than 10. You know, it's small. But again, it's a long-term strategy. I mean, I think that the state and the planning field in general recognizes that this is, you know, not the most impactful strategy in terms of immediate change and difference, but for the longer term, there are good reasons to pursue it, not only for greenhouse gases, but also for some of the quote-unquote co-benefits.
In the pictures of San Diego, when it was comparing, there are two plans, their initial one and then the one that they redid.
Yes.
So the housing looked like it was significantly less. Was it just a lot more dense, or did they account for less numbers of additional?
No, I think it was just redistributed in terms of location.
Thank you for your presentation. It's really interesting. I was wondering, because I noticed that you analyzed like, the political party and how that mattered. Did you look at all like a conservative area, and were there certain like things in sustainability that worked better with like conservative areas that might be more resistant to something like that?
We didn't look, so we included all responding cities in our model. Might be interesting to try to model something with just cities that had, say, a larger, above a certain threshold of Republican or Libertarian vote share. But we anticipated that very effect. We thought that, cities with a higher share of conservative voters would be less likely to adopt these strategies, that they would be resistant to any type of land use regulation, or that would be viewed as infringement on property rights, but we did not notice that effect. The only thing that showed up really was the Green Party voters, and on some of the individual strategies, when we modeled them, the percent voter share of Democrats was important. But there wasn't enough of a pattern there to say much. Yes, Michael.
That's really, really great work, and really sort of begins to fill in, a significant sort of gap in literature. I guess my main question would be, in the way that the survey questions were framed and then interpreted in the empirical work, when a city said, yeah, we're implementing these strategies, did that mean implementation? Because if there's some City of Austin people here, but I think if you survey the City of Austin, we have all these strategies. But either, for a variety of reasons, they may not be significantly implementing these strategies. Did you kind of think about that, the meaning of that, or impact that at all?
Absolutely. So, I mean, the answer is, certainly our measure is definitely not perfect. Our survey question was worded to ask whether or not their zoning code or zoning ordinance provided for any of these strategies. And so they either said yes or no or don't know. Just because it's in their zoning strategy, or it's something in their zoning, doesn't necessarily mean they're doing anything about it. One, I mean, there are numerous cases in which that might be true. The city might have, and this was true for a lot of California cities over the last number of years. There could be so little growth due to the economic recession that they had no way to know whether or not they, their zoning code might say, yeah, we'll provide for increased density in this area, but if nobody wants to build there, they're not increasing density, they're not doing anything, it's just on the books. Or they might have provisions to do more mixed use, but when push comes to shove, if a neighborhood group says no, then maybe they'll turn it down. So it's hard to know. And I think that maybe gets to why some of this, some of the literature around implementation is less well developed, is that it's very, very hard to measure. I have seen studies from the public health literature that look at, that really go through the zoning code and don't just rely on the respondent to say yes or no, we have this or we don't. They actually go through and extensively code local governments' zoning ordinances, but that'd be a pretty large project. But I feel your concern.
Would it be feasible to construct this in the future somehow, by looking at actual land use change in books, via building permit? I don't know.
Yes. So I have been working with some colleagues at UCLA they're looking more at the hard data, large data set side of this. How can we measure implementation of SB 375 or at least gauge change? Building permits is one of the things that comes up. That gets complicated in a lot of arenas too. Parcel level data, just because of how it gets collected and reported and who owns it in California. But yeah, I mean, there are more kind of empirical sources, direct sources that could be more attractive. Some of them can be just really hard to get.
Were you able to identify any trends in what types of cities were or weren't utilizing the grant resources that were available to them?
I think we had looked at, and Andrew, you might chime in here. We had looked at whether or not the person responding to the survey was new. So we looked at the number of years they'd been working at the city, because we thought that was anomalous. Gosh, this many cities don't know anything about these grant opportunities. That's no good. But we really didn't find any clear reason that would explain why they were not aware of them. So no.
There wasn't any relationship, perhaps cities with higher population versus cities with lower population, nothing like that?
Yeah, I don't think we tested those. Yeah, we were really puzzled by that. And so, the key things that we asked about were the state grants, but we also asked about whether or not they had tapped any federal grants, any nonprofit or, more generic sources, provided they were using them for implementation of these kinds of policies. So, no.
With the grants, was it only an awareness of the grants that cities were choosing not to utilize those funds, or were there other potential barriers that were keeping them from pursuing?
So the total score, when I showed you that histogram earlier, I can't really scroll back. It's hard to scroll back up here.
Because it seemed like there were some that were
Well,
kind of pursuing it, but not very aggressively.
so the total score was based on, for each grant, you could have earned a maximum of 3 points, whether or not you were aware of the grant, whether or not you had applied for the grant, and whether or not you had secured the grant. So the maximum score would have been, for those 8 things we asked about, 24. And so that score reflects awareness, attempt to apply, and then award. So the award thing is kind of out of their control, but
Or were there cities that were aware but just choosing not to apply?
Yes, yes, definitely. There were cities that were aware but didn't apply. And I think this is coming from some other research that I've been engaged with on this topic that is more interview-based. I think there are a number of cities that, because of the way the grant selection criteria are framed, they kind of look at that grant and say, oh, we have such low chances of getting that grant, we're not going to go for it. And then there are also resource issues. It takes a lot to apply for these grants. So if you're a small city that contracts for a planner for 5 hours of their time a week, that person's not going to be putting together one of these grants for you.
Yes.
Did you group the cities or counties by the campo that they have? I.e., did San Diego have better performance than LA?
We did include that as a variable in the model, their individual MPO, and we did not notice significant regional differences.
We also compared how different the political views of a certain city was to their overall MPO,
Yeah.
and we found that didn't have any relation on it.
Question here, curious, the questionnaire design, is this design like a before and after, say, cities, counties, it did not practice one or more of those smart growth strategies before SSB, passage of the bill or afterwards?
So when we designed the survey, I had thought it might be useful to kind of to get that, did you have this before, did you have it after? I decided not to go that route because, one, we were relying on the respondents' recall, and so you might not have somebody who could accurately reflect what the status of the zoning was pre-SB 375. At this point, that's almost 10 years ago, so that might be a stretch for the respondent, and it might not be that. You might get responses, but I was less confident that they would be accurate. And we did ask some questions. These are not reported here, but let's see. Nope. Okay, I don't have a slide for it. But we did ask them to the extent to which they felt that SB 375 had changed what they do or had an influence. And the response there was a little tepid. So I think most local governments tended to feel that they were doing these things or would be doing them anyway for other reasons, that SB 375 wasn't really it. That also is, I think, confirmed to some extent by this other interview work that I've been doing, where there are really other forces that are more powerful than this law, namely market forces that are making some local governments just do a whole lot and others not do very much.
I thought if you had some questions that you can kind of interpret the before and after change, then that will make the modeling work a lot easier. 0, 1, 0, 1.
Yes.
Look at the direction of behavior, local government's behavior, rather than this really trying to quantify the magnitude of the change in responding to the law. This way is much more difficult than
Yes.
the 0, 1 modeling work.
Yes, we were able to do that with the individual strategies. It was more of a binary outcome, and I will say that this was a learning experience for me too, and there were definitely things that I sort of encountered once we were working with the data. I was like, oh, why did we ask the question like that? And God, why did I think that would be a good dependent variable? Oh my God, what was I thinking? Yeah.
Well, overall, I really like this work. My work mainly on the kind of the other end, as Sciara earlier mentioned, the land use or building land attributes, and then the tribal behavioral outcome. And she was looking at this upstream, large scale, is really interesting here. So now it's time. Any more questions? Well, thank you again for coming to the first city forum.